Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Republicans faced a hugely disappointing midterms as Democrats breathed relief as the anticipated red wave crashed before reaching the shores. What went wrong for the GOP? What went right for Democrats? And just what does the average American think of it all? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special show, we have our dedicated Liberty Nation panel to help dissect the fun and the follies of the 2022 elections. All the facts, all the frenzy. I want to take a moment to thank our listeners out in Cadillac, Missouri on WATT 1240 AM and 106.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Reports suggested a veritable crimson tsunami, but what remained when the dust settled was, in most areas, little more than a trickle of your favorite red wine. Now, what went wrong for the GOP, or perhaps more importantly, what went right for Team Biden? We're fortunate to have on our LN panel with us today a longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, Mr. Graham J. Noble, Jeff Charles, and Scott D. Cosenza. Now, gents, first things first, what happened on the election, Tim?
Well, I think that it's interesting that there's been so much talk about how wrong the polls have been in recent years. This time the polls were essentially right in most of these close races. But in the past, the polls have been good at determining the key issues. And this time they were wrong about that. So it's like a reversal, because we had been assured that abortion had been subsumed by the economy and inflation and crime and the border, and that it was no longer a key issue. Then we come to find out that 27% of voters said that was the most important issue they voted on. It also, they were telling us that groups that were interviewed before the election, groups of voters were saying democracy is threatened. That's not what I'm going to vote on. Well, I think in a lot of the races where Trump-backed controversial candidates were, that became an issue as well. And I think it was underrated by the polls in advance. Look, both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, both believed there was going to be a red wave, that it would just be a matter of how much. And the fact that there isn't is going to be a cause for a lot of soul searching among Republicans who failed to really take solid control of the House, although they will get all the committee assignments and committee heads, and there's a lot of advantages to even having a one-vote majority. But there's going to be a lot of soul-searching and a lot of questioning in the GOP.
Tim, you mentioned the polling that was done for the groups. I guess those are the exit polls where people talked about what impacted them. Now, Scott, do people in blue states just happen to like soaring inflation and rampant crime, in your opinion? Did they develop some kind of Stockholm syndrome during the coronavirus pandemic, do you think?
I'm going to be like a great politician, Mark, and answer a different question than the one that you asked me, which I'm going to comment on. You said to Tim, what went wrong for Republicans in the election? And Tim responded, and he used the word election. And there was no plural in either of your statements. And I just think that while there can be some information drawn by the general trends of things, these were hundreds and over 1,000 elections that took place in America, and I just don't think it's best to kind of think of them as a group rather than individual contests. That I think is really the answer. Is they have to be picked apart individually, which of course we're not going to go through 1,000 elections. So I understand it's important to talk about the trends, but I just wanted to get that out. That I do think that's sort of a critical factor as we go forward. But I just think, like, if we're thinking about, like, why did Stacey Abrams lose and John Fetterman win? He is, the worst possible candidate that you can think of, except for somebody who's like assaulting children or somebody like that, and meanwhile, she, for a Georgia audience, is she really that, worse than Fetterman? I would have bet a lot of my net worth that those two would have flipped, right? That Fetterman would have lost, and she had all that celebrity support.
Yeah.
I mean,
I can tell you what the difference was. The difference was the gubernatorial candidate on the ballot in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano, was a disaster as a gubernatorial candidate, and that brought Dr. Memenaz down with him. In Georgia, you had Brian Kemp, very popular governor, and he carried Herschel Walker to at least the point of a runoff in Georgia. So, there's drag on a ticket in a midterm. If you have, in Ohio, for example, Mike DeWine won a 25-point victory for re-election as governor, and that dragged J.D. Vance across the finish line with a solid 7-point victory. That was the opposite of Pennsylvania. So one candidate on the ballot in a particular state can really have an effect down ballot or cross ballot on the other ones running for office.
Well, what do you think, Graham? Is it all coattails?
I certainly agree with Scott's analysis there that these are different races. You can't lump them all in together. But at the same time, I think a lot of this has to do with Democrat voters. I believe a lot of them in the end bought the narrative coming out of their party that these issues that Republicans are banging on about, which is crime and inflation, are not really things that we can blame Congress or the Biden administration for. Inflation's a global problem right now, so is it really anyone's fault over here? Crime, is there really, apart from some parts of the country, is crime really on the rise, or is it like as New York Governor Kathy Hochul said, it's really just a myth. It's a conspiracy theory on the part of the GOP. And I think Democrat voters, a lot of them thought to themselves, are we willing to relinquish control of the Senate to the Republicans based on these problems, which are larger problems and beyond our ability to control? As a result of Democrat voters not voting on the economy or crime or the border, they instead voted on more emotive issues such as abortion and the threat to democracy.
That's a good take on it. Jeff, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what happened. But like I've been saying, I think a part of the problem is that Republicans didn't really put forth a good alternative in a lot of these races. Doug Mastriano was not a good candidate. Bolduc in New Hampshire was not a good candidate. In some ways, the Democratic strategy of funding these people that are viewed as ultra right wing or MAGA or whatever you want to call them, it did have a level of success. But then you have a guy like Brian Kemp, who was not very in line with Trump at all, really, who even clashed with him, but still maintained enough popularity to defeat his opponent. Same thing with Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. He won his election handily, 60% of the vote. And while he has affiliated with Trump, he hasn't made his entire brand about Trump. So I think that what's happening is that when Republicans put forth a candidate that has a lot of the important issues in common with the America First crowd, without a lot of the other noise, they do better. Even in Georgia, that's going to go to a runoff between Warnock and Herschel Walker. Yes. And I'm not very confident that Walker is going to win in a runoff election. So on the right, you do have a problem with candidates, and I think that there may have been a missed opportunity for Republicans, but I don't think that Democrats are out of the woods yet either. I think the next couple of years are going to be very hard on them politically.
So not one overall thing, but 1,000 leaves of grass. Right, yeah. Gentlemen, we're with the LN panel talking about what happened during the midterm breakdown for Republicans and for Democrats. And we'll be right back after this short break talking the biggest shocks of the night. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Tim Donner, Graham J. Noble, Jeff Charles, and Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, unraveling the red wave that never was. Now, in the last segment, we talked about what happened during the elections. But now I want to do a round robin on what race really surprised you the most. And Just so no one takes my pride of place here, I'll go first. So for me, it was Lee Zeldin in the New York gubernatorial against Kathy Hochul. Now, yeah, he lost, absolutely, but it was getting close, and I think it finished just under 6% difference between him and Hochul. And when you consider how many diehard Democrats there are, I think he performed incredibly well. I mean, everyone came out against him, didn't they? You had the media against him, you had the big guns of the Democratic Party with their endorsements, and pretty much a campaign of terror from the White House about, as was mentioned earlier, about the GOP in general. For me, that was the big surprise of the night, that he did as well as he did. Jeff, you can take the next one.
You know, we're going to go to the South, in South Texas, where I'm in Texas. I'm not in South Texas, but we had 3 highly anticipated races involving Latinas running on the Republican ticket. We had Mayra Flores, Monica de la Cruz, Cassie Garcia, and 2 of them lost. And the one that's most surprising to me is Mayra Flores, because she originally won back in June in a special election. And she was getting pretty popular on the right. And then Texas did some redistricting in a way that gave her opponent, Vicente Gonzalez, the advantage. So she ended up losing her race. And what's interesting is that redistricting also contributed to the win of Monica de la Cruz. So, I mean, it's kind of a wash there. But those races were highly anticipated because they were expected to show how much ground the Republican Party has gained with Latino voters. But even the fact that they did fairly well in their elections shows that they are making up ground. I mean, the last race was against Henry Cuellar, who is very popular in his district. He's been there since 2005. And he tends to lean right on some issues like abortion and the border. So it's not a surprise that he won.
The last pro-life Democrat in Congress, I believe. That's self-styled moniker.
That's
true.
true.
I wish I'd chosen your one, Jeff. Your one's much more analytical than mine. All right, let's go to Scott's laughing at me, so we'll go to Scott next. Go on.
I am surprised that Fetterman won in Pennsylvania. Oz did no help to his own candidacy in the last couple of weeks of it. It seems like stumble after stumble, but still the idea of, and I'm somebody who I'm perfectly capable of voting for somebody, not because of them, but for the leadership that they'll vote for, and then how that'll affect the country. So a vote for Chuck Schumer versus the future leader of a Republican Senate, I get that. But also, his communication difficulties are so profound. It just, I'm just really shocked that there's that many people in Pennsylvania who also don't seem to care about the candidate and just seem to care more about, they're on Team Blue, and so they're going to vote blue.
It's almost a cruelty, isn't it? I mean, that's the way it seems to me. Am I wrong in that? What do you think, Graham?
Yeah, well, I mean, that was definitely one of the biggest shocks of the night, surely, for everybody. I mean, I did not expect, and again, I was never exactly a huge fan. I was of Dr. Mehmet Oz, but I still have a hard time getting my head around the fact that Fetterman actually won that competition. And of course, was it partly down to the this early voting, which is getting ridiculous, where we now have election seasons, not even election weeks or election months, but election seasons. It seems that I'm sure people are already out there in some parts of the country voting for their presidential pick for 2024.
So, Graham, what's your big shock for you then?
Well, several really. I must admit, I actually did believe that Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan would lose her race. I don't know, while I don't know an awful lot about Tudor Dixon, it seems to me that Whitmer was one of the most extreme governors, well, perhaps along with Kathy Hochul as well in New York, but she was one of the most zealous about grabbing for herself all kinds of, extra powers, emergency powers, and then clinging on to them. And she seemed to run Michigan almost like some kind of quasi-dictatorship. And I honestly expected her to not win re-election. So that was that was a shock for me, that one.
That's a good call on.
I think, though, that, Mark, to me, the biggest surprise, other than Fetterman, which is, I said to myself when I got up this morning, I can't believe I live in a country where a guy like John Fetterman, who begins a debate by saying, good night, can actually win. But it shows you, as others have discussed, that if you've got
VP
a pulse,
material, if we're going by current standards.
if you've got a pulse, you will be elected by Democrats. Maybe it's true with Republicans too. But to me, the biggest surprise of all has to be Florida, because everybody knew DeSantis was going to win. Everybody knew Rubio was going to win. But you figured DeSantis by maybe 10 points, 11. He won by 20 points. I mean, he became king of Florida. And beyond that, Marco Rubio won by 16 points. This makes Florida essentially like Alabama politically, because incredibly, this state, which for so long was the most crucial swing state in the country, now has not a single elected Democratic official in the entire state. No statewide officials are
Tim,
Democrats.
how many of those 20 points that DeSantis won by were from people who 4 years ago were not residents of the state of Florida?
Well, probably a lot. And I'll tell you what, DeSantis barely eked out a victory over a candidate, Andrew Gillum, 4 years ago, who wound up being a total mess personally, got caught with prostitutes and drugs and all kinds of stuff.
Not to mention the numerous
rehab.
Indictments he's facing.
So he won, I think DeSantis, I think the number was that he won by something like 60 or 70,000 votes 4 years ago. Last night, he won by like 1.5 million. So to me, the utter domination of the GOP in Florida is the biggest surprise. And it makes me believe that at this point, DeSantis doesn't even have any choice but to run for president. And I think the other surprise for me is that the Trump-backed candidates, the ones who wouldn't have won their nominations but for Trump, and that would be Blake Masters in Arizona, who I guess still has a chance, but he's running behind Herschel Walker in Georgia, who's going to be forced into a runoff in a seat that they should have won. And of course, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriani, was a disaster as a gubernatorial candidate in the Keystone State. J.D. Vance was about the only one who actually came through, and that was because the governor there was so popular, DeWine, and he won by 25 points. But Ohio is underrated for last night, too, because those victories by DeWine and Vance solidify Ohio, along with Florida, as now being what you might call ruby red, blood red states. And that changes the electoral map.
Okay, and you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, special midterm analysis here on the Radio America Network. We'll be right back after this break discussing Ron DeSantis and the Florida Blitz. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with our LN panel, Tim Donner, Jeff Charles, Graham J. Noble, and Scott D. Cosenza. Now, earlier in the show, we've talked about the red wave failing to materialize and some of the biggest shocks of the night. And I think it's quite clear that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis had a pretty good night, as we discussed earlier. Now, Graham, is what Ron DeSantis did in Florida, is that replicable across the nation? And what does that portend for the future?
It would be nice from a conservative leaning point of view to say that, yes, it is. I'm not sure that it is. It's certainly replicable across all of the red states, without a doubt. But could DeSantis actually, if, say, he was to run for president and win the GOP nomination, could he translate his wild seemingly limitless popularity in Florida now? Could he translate that onto the national stage? I'm not really so sure. And I think if he were to become the GOP nominee this time around, assuming he runs, which I don't necessarily think he will, I think the level of savagery that will be directed at him by the left and the media and the Democrats will actually make people start to think that Trump actually had it pretty easy.
Well, he's obviously literally the new Hitler as opposed to literally the old Hitler, rather than literally an actual Hitler.
He's like
Elon
Joseph
keeps
Goebbels
Twitter free. It's going to be hard to do to him what they did to Trump.
Literally Hitler 2.0.
2.0. That's the working one.
But look, I mean, DeSantis, I don't have any problem believing he could translate what he's done in Florida to the country, because look at some of the groups that he won. He won the Hispanic vote. He'd have to do that nationally. He won votes in Miami-Dade County, which is as hardcore Democrat as you can get. He won 62 out of 67 counties in a very diverse state. Okay. And Florida, let me also point out that Florida is a place where people have moved from all over the country. So it's a very diverse population. I think the reason he almost has to run, DeSantis, is that this is his time. When you have the kind of victory that he had, combined with the fact that the person who would be his chief rival, of course, Donald Trump, had a bad night. Only J.D. Vance, among the people that he had pushed into the nomination, really had a good night. Herschel Walker has lived to fight another day because of the runoff rule, which, by the way, ironically, could benefit the Republicans this time, because if they didn't have it, Raphael Warnock would have won this race already. DeSantis is Trumpism without Trump. He's Trumpism without the toxic personality that has attached to Trump. And I think that, when you can take someone who's a polished professional politician like Ron DeSantis, who has just absolutely soared as a star he's a rock star after last night, there's no question. I think that translates nationally, and I think it actually will put Trump on the defensive, because at this point, how many Republicans would prefer Trump to DeSantis given the choice? I think those numbers might have changed overnight.
When you ran down the election results in the last segment, Tim, I thought, gee, the big loser on election night is Donald Trump. That's the big loser. He
is a big loser because his candidate, there was always skepticism about his candidates, but it looks like the Democrat strategy of throwing money at these MAGA candidates actually worked. And it also looks like, the scorched earth, if you elect Republicans, it will be the end of the world, actually worked. We were mocking them. I was among them. And the voters were saying that's not working with me, but in a lot of cases, I guess they were lying too.
So, I've seen since the results of the elections came out, I've seen so many left-leaning outlets talk about this specific issue, that there was character flaws. They were poor candidates or poor quality candidates. And it's repeated again and again ad infinitum. But I keep thinking, this is the same side that supported the candidacy of John Fetterman. And in terms of a low quality candidate, Jeff, what do you think? Is there any worse candidate than that?
I might be tempted to believe that if I didn't see so many people on the right saying the exact same thing. Remember how the base reacted when Trump endorsed Dr. Oz? They weren't having it. Even with Herschel Walker to a certain extent. I mean, even though people like Herschel Walker, everybody in Georgia loves Herschel Walker, they know what kind of baggage that he has. They've seen him speak on TV. They know what they're dealing with here. And I think with DeSantis, he is not tested on the national stage yet. But I think on the right, even before the midterms, I keep getting the sense that people like Trump, but they're ready to move on. And I know that flies in the face of all the polling that's been done about the potential 2024 primaries. Trump defeats DeSantis by a lot. And that gap has kind of closed, but Trump is still way ahead. But I kind of question that. I mean, these polls are being taken and DeSantis isn't even in the running. What happens if he were to announce and then they actually start campaigning? Would those numbers change, especially with Trump kind of shooting himself in the foot here and there with these bad midterm results? It's already been shown that a lot of the people that he picked in critical races weren't the best people. I think that there are a lot of people, and I'm not saying Trump would necessarily lose, but I think there is this sense of people wanting to say, let's just get past all the drama. Yes, they will attack DeSantis just like they attacked Trump, probably even worse. But there's a difference between being attacked with a fully loaded gun, which would happen with Trump because he has so much baggage, and a gun with maybe one bullet. I mean, they're not going to be as effective against DeSantis as they might be against Trump. And I think that's the sense that people are getting.
So you and I, we've talked about this numerous occasions on Liberty Nation Radio about the East and West Coast exodus to Florida. So you've got people in these far-flung places that already want to live under Ron DeSantis, right? So isn't that kind of the point you're making, that he isn't nationally despised by so many people? Obviously, Trump is very popular with people who support him and very, very unpopular with those that don't. How do you square the circle here for me, Scott?
Well, you don't. It's going to be Trump versus DeSantis in a battle that will tear up the Republican Party and may sufficiently damage their chances for a presidency in 2024 that Joe Biden could win re-election.
I think
I think I heard Graham Noble say that on the Conservative Five, Ellen's roundtable series. But if it wasn't him, it was somebody else. I do think that it really will have a existential impact on the future. Donald Trump is toxic to so many people, some within the Republican Party and of course, obviously those on the opposite side, and just not true for DeSantis.
He's also young. He's got plenty of time to run for president, but this is his time. I mean, he has ascended as high as he could ever possibly go. But I do agree that, it would be an absolute blowout of a Republican primary because Trump takes no prisoners. And the fact that DeSantis believes all the same things as Trump doesn't matter. DeSantis would be bludgeoned by Trump, same way as Little Marco and Lion Ted and Crooked Hillary.
Low energy Jeb.
He's going to try. I don't know that he's going to be successful, Tim.
Would be brutalized.
There's plenty to go after Trump for.
I mean, honestly, the fact that, the best that he could come up with Ron DeSanctimonious, I don't know if Trump's attacks will land on DeSantis the way they landed on Jeb Bush, because, DeSantis is not Jeb Bush. He has a lot more likability. So I think Trump will savage him, definitely, and some of those blows will land. But Ron can kind of punch back too. He's just not as he's more of a pugilist, and Trump's more of a brawler, right? Yes. So it'll be interesting to see those two go at it.
That's a good way to put it.
I'm going to throw out a hypothetical here for the panel, and that is that I'm going to put myself in the mind of Ron DeSantis. And we start with the fact that Donald Trump is going to run in 2020. Of that, I have no doubt, and I don't think anyone really doubts that.
Agreed.
I think he's going to run in 2020. And
2024, right?
Sorry, not 20.
We recorded this 4 years ago.
Well, it's because
going out live.
We were very prescient. It's amazing.
We have so much deja vu going on right now that I can't even. Sometimes I think I'm back in 2020. But anyway, so Trump's going to run for 2024. So what does DeSantis perhaps think to himself? He thinks, well, I just got a phenomenal thumbs up from the people of Florida, and I could either stay down here in sunny Florida and serve out another term as governor here, and then in 2028, when Trump is obviously out of the picture, whatever happens, then I can step in and I'll have just like almost probably a clear field to the GOP nomination for the White House. I could do that. And if I do that and stay here in Florida and keep my powder dry, I don't have to get into a nasty barroom brawl with Trump on the national stage. And say what you want about DeSantis, smart guy, savvy politician, but is he going to win a nomination fight with Trump? I don't believe he is, even after last night. And therefore, and if he loses the nomination to Trump, that actually kind of also damages his political cachet. He can avoid all of that by staying in Florida and biding his time for another 4 years. So, am I right about all of that? I'm just thinking that maybe those kind of thoughts might be going through his head.
Wise words indeed from Graham J. Noble. Now, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back shortly with the LM panel discussing the disunited states of America. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Next up, I want us to consider just how united these particular states are. Now, Scott, nice simple question for you.
I'm the wrong person to come to for this one, buddy.
I
was discussing which country would be a good exit plan to reach to earlier this morning with a Liberty Nation colleague
Florida.
who I will.
There's a Florida.
The nation of Florida under King Ron DeSantis. Scott, nice simple one for you here. Is the union healthier today than it was last week?
I think it continues to decline in its health, Mark, and it has for some time. I'm not optimistic. I, want to fight for it, and I think there's value there for a nation conceived in liberty to fight for. But I'm not convinced that we're headed down a good path.
Okay, Jeff, moving on for this one. Surely elections are supposed to be at least the way to bring people together rather than to split them apart, aren't they?
I don't know that that's ever been the case. I mean, America's been divided before. I mean, and even in unity, there is still division because Americans disagree on a lot of things. We have two parties. We have a bunch of different warring ideologies. But I do agree that we are headed towards a very unhealthy place, and we've been headed there for years. People like to blame it on Trump. Trump was just the symptom of the disease. And unfortunately, I get asked the question, do you think it's going to get better? And I do. I am white-pilled, but I do think that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I think that we're heading into that worse right now. These elections are just the tip of the iceberg. Remember, we still got investigations from the FBI into Trump. A lot of people believe that those investigations are politically motivated, not against just Trump, but also his allies. So people are getting the sense that he's getting railroaded. If the GOP does end up retaking the House, they're going to be investigating the FBI, Hunter Biden, all kinds of things. And so, I mean, we're already divided enough, but it's probably going to get worse because of these issues and whatever else might come up in the next, couple of years or so.
All right, great. Graham, moving on to you. Joe Biden, he promised when he was inaugurated in 2020, January 2021, when he was inaugurated, he promised unity. He was going to be the unity president. How do you think that stands today? And how do you think that stands going on from these recent elections?
Well, it almost seems...
We're all giggling here because we can kind of figure out where this is going to go. But it's a valid question to ask because maybe there's an element after the elections here that he doesn't have to worry about campaigning again because he's probably not going to be ready to run in 2024, right? So he has the opportunity. That's why I asked. Sorry, Graham, please carry on.
No, I think we almost get tired of hearing, which we have, I think, at least since the presidency of George W. Bush, we have heard from the people on the other side, whichever president it is, the people on the other side say, oh, this guy is dividing us. We've never been so divided as forever before. That I remember that when George W. Bush was president, when Barack Obama was president, obviously when Trump was president, and now when Biden is president. But I can't remember really I can't remember George W. Bush or Barack Obama or Barack Obama came close, but I really don't recall any of those three presidents, Trump, Obama, George W. Bush, actually going after basically half the electorate of the country as hard as Joe Biden has done. And it's incredible that on one day he can literally turn around and say that he's brought back civility to the White House and he's uniting the country. And then literally 5 minutes later, he'll say, but all of those MAGA Republicans are dangerous. And it's incredible. And the thing is, I unfortunately, I really believe, and I hate to believe the worst of this country because, I came here and I'm very glad I did move to this country. And I actually still believe it is just about still the greatest country in the world. And I hate to think the worst of Americans, but I honestly believe that a great many Americans now have gotten to the point where they feel that there are more things that divide us than unite us. And I think there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who are no longer even interested in talking about unity. They don't want it. I think that a lot of Democrat voters out there, they don't want unity. They feel they have nothing whatsoever in common with conservatives, with Republicans. They think that those people are mean and evil and selfish and only care about themselves and their precious constitutional rights. And I really don't believe there is a prevailing will in the country for us to come back to a place of commonality.
All right, Scott, Tim, what about you? What do you think? Is there a commonality between all the sides?
Well, the Democratic Party has got more progressive. The Republican Party has got more conservative, nationalist, populist. And so it begs the question of whether the center can hold, because any democracy, which is the big word this year, suddenly everybody's talking about democracy, not a constitutional republic, which is what we are. But be that as it may, for our form of government to survive, the center has to hold. You can't have the extremes. And I think Biden succeeded in convincing enough people that anybody that voted for Trump is extreme and is a threat to democracy, that it was just enough to stave off what could have been, a red tide that washed over them. Both sides retreated to their corners. And the proof of that, the irrefutable proof, is John Fetterman. There's no way that guy could possibly win a Senate seat without the idea that you're simply going to vote for your tribe. Politics have become so tribal that if John Fetterman can win, and maybe the Democrats will say the same thing about Herschel Walker, that if
already are.
Win, yes, they already are.
Maybe if the Republicans in Pennsylvania ran a Pennsylvanian for the office of senator from Pennsylvania, that might have helped their cause as well, Tim.
I mean, it's a unique idea, Scott.
He was a ridiculous candidate, I thought, at his outset. He's a TV guy. That's why Trump favored him. Trump has that TV thing. That's what he likes, his celebrity. And that's what cost them this Senate race.
There's nothing to say, though, that the other candidate that was running against Oz would have done any better, because none of them were very impressive either.
So it seems that we are united in disagreement. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being here. And that's about all we have time for on this week's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Jeff Charles, Graham J. Noble, and Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us. My final thought for this week, I'll just leave you with a simple observation from Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist. He noted, quote, "Politicians are like bad horsemen who are so preoccupied with staying in the saddle that they can't bother about where they're going," end quote. And I feel we can all agree that about sums up modern politics. We're just strapped to the horse and along for the bumpy ride. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's the left-free zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner, joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing leftist narratives, debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.